Now, for more to discuss it all in studio, I'm joined now by international affairs analyst Dan Perry, former Europe and Middle East editor for the Associated Press. Dan, great to have you with us on the Rundown, as always.
Great to be here.
A lot for us to discuss, but I want to begin with these efforts towards a ceasefire. Now that we're hearing more and more of this confirmation from the United States, they're confident that in this next week, a deal can be reached for a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. And this is really the hot topic, the main item on Netanyahu's agenda. But Netanyahu also says that they're close to finding some of these countries, to taking Gazans who want to leave. This is all part of the bigger picture here. The day after, what can actually happen in Gaza? Because without addressing the day after, do you think in this next week a ceasefire can be reached?
Yes, I think it can, because it puts off the big decisions about the day after and about the entire edifice of ending the war. So it's another partial deal, which only releases some of the hostages. And in the first stage, if I understand correctly, only a quarter of the 20 remaining hostages. So this is creating great unhappiness in Israel, because the idea of these phased releases and of continuing to risk every day, over 60 days and maybe beyond that, if there's no agreement reached then, the lives of so many hostages is vastly unpopular, and I think rightly so. You know, there's a joke making rounds in Israel, when there's one hostage left, Netanyahu will insist on receiving him in phases. It's macabre humor, but it reflects the reality. Now, why don't they just do a deal? Because they don't yet have for everything at once. Because that would involve pulling out of Gaza and leaving Hamas there. Hamas has not agreed to disarm. The question is whether by dragging things out another 2 months, you increase the chances they agree to disarm. I'm extremely skeptical, so I would do things in an entirely different way. But this seems to be the way they've chosen, and I do think the chances that a deal of that type is struck in coming days is high.
We see the deadly consequences of this war continuing yet again, and we're seeing these efforts in the United States to try and make some sort of a deal simultaneously with the efforts in Doha. But is there enough pressure on Hamas right now to actually come to the table and agree to the deal? What other options could be on the table?
There's a theory that maybe Qatar or Egypt could somehow pressure Hamas more, maybe more publicly. But, you know, Hamas is a maniacal, genocidal, jihadist terrorist group. They don't tend to necessarily always be rational, and they sanctify death and even sometimes accept suicide in their most radical manifestations. So I wouldn't be terribly optimistic that what has not been accomplished over 21 months will be somehow accomplishable in another month or 2 or 3. If I were the leadership of the country, I would be looking at different paradigms, maybe more complex. You know, whatever they do will be imperfect, and it's a question of risk management. But as so often is the case in the Middle East, the question is, what is the least bad option? And I think a forever war, or certainly war that lasts another year or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, against an insurgency, while the hostages die one by one in the tunnels, may not be the least bad option. I think there's other ways to approach this.
And what are those ways?
Well, I mean, if I was a government, I would end the war now. The same terms that are being offered now were offered really in the beginning of the war, and at that point I would have said no. But by now Hamas has been very much degraded. Whoever wanted Gaza punished, they should be satisfied with the punishment. It's unbelievable what happened in the Strip. It's devastated. Most of Hamas's battalions have been dispersed, but there remains an insurgency. I would give the Palestinians and Hamas 2 choices. I would say, yeah, fine, war is over. We're pulling out to a perimeter. And you have 2 scenarios. One, you don't disarm, because that's what's on the table. Will they disarm or not? And in that case, no other group will agree to come in, including the PA. And things remain as they are. And humanitarian aid will continue. But no reconstruction will go in, because you're going to steal the money and build more tunnels. And you know, Palestinians who want to come out, who we organize alternative temporary refuge for, will be allowed to come out. Now, this is Hamas's nightmare, a depopulation of the Strip. Something I can't believe that it was never on the table, but at that point, it would be inhumane to let them out of a place still run by Hamas where most buildings are destroyed. If you want that, then that's what you can have. But if you do disarm, then a mountain of rewards awaits you, including an alternative fair government. Almost certainly has to be run by the PA. This Israeli fantasy that the PA can't be involved is just nonsensical. That's what it's going to have to be, with assistance, with reforms and so forth. Tens of billions, maybe 100 billion, already essentially in escrow in the Gulf, will go into reconstruction. whatever's left of Hamas's leadership, they'll probably be offered exile, and they hand over the weapons, and they go. And the Strip will truly be rebuilt. And it will become a model of what can happen when jihadists are pushed aside. Now, I'm under no illusion that Hamas will immediately say, okay, fine. But that will create a new dynamic where within 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, polls will show that 90% of Palestinians want option B. And the pressure will be enormous. And whoever insists on sticking with option A will face probably some version of a civil war in Gaza, because there are disagreements within Hamas, different factions. There's armed gangs, some of which are collaborating with Israel today. And this will play out. But if Israel just insists on fighting and fighting and fighting until Hamas is eradicated by force, the Americans discovered in Iraq that is a pretty good way to have a decade's worth of insurgency. And you know what? Even if anyone in Israel wanted to go that route, that means sacrificing the hostages. And it's very unpopular. And I think Netanyahu knows this. So my personal guess is all Trump's got to do is say, listen to I24, choose option B, and I'll give you all kinds of goodies. He knows that even if the fanatics in this coalition abandon him, the moderate Israeli opposition will give him an umbrella in parliament, and that'll be that.
Well, let's certainly hope that they are.
And by the way, then there's a lot more that can happen in the Middle East, including peace with Saudi Arabia and more.
6 p.m. Eastern time. We know these two leaders are meeting once again. In your ideal image, what will come from this meeting tonight, the second in just 24 hours?
My ideal is not what seems likely. It would be that they announce that Israel agrees to what I was just outlining before. That's not going to happen because Witkoff is on his way to Doha, where an Israeli negotiation team awaits. And it's back to the same old paradigm where Israel is trying to convince Hamas to agree to something plausible. I think Israel and the U.S. should act in concert to try to bring about a new dynamic that doesn't rely on anyone else agreeing to something plausible, but where they drive events. And I tried to describe that before. Seems unlikely. But I do think that Trump should make clear that alongside his vast support for Israel and his willingness to essentially buy for Israel acceptance in ever greater circles of the region, pressure Netanyahu to understand that the wise thing is to wind up a war that is costing Israel far too dearly.
We will all certainly be watching what comes from this second meeting in just 24 hours, as I said. But international affairs analyst Dan Perry, it is great to hear your insight as always. Thank you.
Thank you.